He is known nationally as an expert in tribal forestry, as well as building and maintaining tribal relations. Mike Dockry's current aim in his research is to integrate tribal knowledge of forestry and ecology into future land management plans while respecting and supporting tribal sovereignty. Today, Mike will be talking to us about building partnerships with tribes in order to better land management strategies for the future. Without further interruptions, please give a warm welcome to Mike Dockry.
Thank you, Tess, and welcome, Mike.
Thank you. That was a great introduction, Tess. I really appreciate that. Well, good morning, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here with you today. I thank you for inviting me, and hopefully I'll be able to spark some really good conversation and perhaps provide a different perspective than you've heard on public lands in the US. I'm going to share my PowerPoint now, so share screen. Oops, I think I need to get access to that.
Sorry about that. This is why we need Mackenzie.
No,
Perfect.
That's good. Let me try to start the presentation. There, how does that work pretty well?
Looks great.
Okay, great. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the building partnerships with tribes as well as the public land management to really try to keep true to this course and the celebration of public land management. As Tess said, I'm a professor at University of Minnesota, and I'm a member of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation. Our traditional territories are basically the southern part of Lake Michigan, and we were removed, as a lot of tribes east of the Mississippi were, removed in the 1830s to Kansas, and then the tribe sort of bifurcated at that point, and my family moved down to Oklahoma to take allotments down there in the 1860s. I don't have to do too much more, but if you're interested, I've worked with tribes my whole career aside from being a tribal member. And I got an internship with the Oneida Nation, which is outside of Green Bay, Wisconsin, where I'm from and grew up. And that really put me on the path to that put me on my career path, really. I studied forestry and ecology before that, and always felt this need to see where the people were in the story, in the science that I was learning about. And when I got my master's degree, I moved back home, and I was waiting to join the Peace Corps. I knew I was going to Bolivia, didn't really speak Spanish or know what I was getting into, but I needed a job for 6 to 9 months. And I got a job with the Oneida tribe in their planning department. And almost from day one, I saw, oh, this is where people fit in. Planning, we have management plans. We can use our science and our knowledge to really achieve goals and objectives that the community wants. And those lessons from that early time really put me on my career path. I revised forest management plans for the Green Mountain and Finger Lakes National Forests in Vermont and New York. I worked then with the College of Menominee Nation, one of the 36 tribal colleges in Wisconsin is the College of Menominee Nation, and really learned, as Tess said, learned from the Menominee about how they've understood sustainability, understood forestry. I won't talk too much about that, but it's a really interesting story. Needless to say, kind of what Tess mentioned, sustainable forestry, that is cutting trees and milling timber in a sustainable manner, really started on the Menominee Reservation in Wisconsin in the mid 1850s. There are laws on the books before there was a Forest Service in 1890 in particular that mandated a limit to harvesting on that reservation. And I point to that and say, look, this is happening before we have Forest Service, before we have forestry schools in the United States, around the same time, but it really did start with Menominee. And that's an important thing to remember because we don't often hear that story, right? This is an indigenous community leading the way in sustainable forest management from the beginning of the entire idea of sustainable forestry. And then as Emily, Professor Walkid, how do sorry.
You can say any way you want, but it's Wakefield.
Wakefield. You're like semi-hidden under there, and I don't have my email. I'm so sorry.
No, you're
I was in the Peace Corps in Bolivia for a number of years, and that kind of set me up to work internationally as well. So that's a little bit about me. The outline for today, I'm going to talk about tribal lands, which is essentially the reservation lands. And then I'm going to get into obligations that we have for tribes in our public land management. And you'll see how those things come together pretty well. And then I'm going to shift gears and try to talk about some of the research we've done around building partnerships with tribes. In particular, I think one of the papers you might have read before today, it's the Building Bridges, where we interviewed U.S. Forest Service employees that work with tribes to see how they do it. And this new paper, which just this week, we got the link to the final copy, which is nice, on our wild rice or our Monoman project. I'm going to talk about some lessons that we learned in both those, and then we can have a discussion about it. So, American Indian forestry. There's over 570 federally recognized tribes in the United States. I think it's 574. There's also tribes that are seeking federal recognition. Some tribes are recognized by states, but not federal government. Some tribes are recognized by neither and are also seeking that recognition. So this number constantly changes. It's a long process to become federally recognized, but it's trending upward. Of these tribes, about 300 have significant forest lands, totaling around 19 million acres. That's pretty significant. And especially, as I'll show a map of Idaho, but that's a lot of land that the tribes are managing. And it's really important, especially when we think about ecosystems crossing political boundaries, right? These tribes have managed these lands to meet all sorts of different goals for many, many generations. I'm a planner. I do a lot of management planning, goals and objectives. That's kind of what I live and breathe. What are we doing management for? And tribes have been doing it for all sorts of goals for many generations. And they've managed these lands through many, many changes. I often tell a story about my tribe's removal from the southern part of Lake Michigan to Oklahoma in the context of climate change. Because our Great Lakes region's summers are predicted to look more like Oklahoma than they do than what we've had. And so, we've managed that change. We're still a tribe, we're still a people. We have our traditions, our language, our culture. It's been tough, but we're very resilient. And the changes are ecological, the changes are social, the changes are economic as well. And we've managed through that. And then finally on this slide, I always put the bullet so I don't forget this, but all these tribes are different, right? They're separate nations, they're separate governments, and they have unique cultures and histories. The other thing I always say is that it's important to recognize that within each tribe, there's diversity as well. Diversity of knowledges, diversity of political ways to see the world. And so, for example, we're sitting here in the United States with a very divided kind of country, right? Not everybody agrees with the government that's in power at any given time. Tribes are the same way, right? Not everyone, there's no monolithic tribal voice for all the tribes. And even within a tribe, there's no monolithic voice. Although the caveat is the tribal government does speak for the tribe at that moment in time, right? Just like our government speaks, whoever is the president is speaking as president of the United States in any given moment. Okay, here's a map showing the federal lands and Indian reservations in the United States. This national atlas.gov I can't find it anymore. I don't know where the government keeps these anymore, but there are a few. You can find all of these on the web if you search. The key terms is federal lands and Indian reservations map. But you can see all the lands, the top color there the top color and the key is those are all the Indian reservations. And if you can see my pointer, which I think you can, this is the Menominee Nation where I worked. I worked with the Oneida Nation. This is Green Bay, Wisconsin. Here is kind of that traditional Potawatomi territory. Here in the east, we have a lot of national forest land. The Park Service land and the Fish and Wildlife refuges are a little bit smaller, so they don't really show up that easily on this kind of map. But out west, right, you all are living in a lot of federal land on the landscape. Lots of Forest Service, lots of Bureau of Land Management, lots of Park Service. I went in and I dug down and found the same map for Idaho, right? So I was trying to get a kind of a little bit of a lay of the land. And see Boise there, see the national forests, and see the large Indian reservations that you have. The Coeur d'Alene, Nez Perce, Fort Hall. And when I talk about partnerships, one of the main things I say is look at all that common boundary, right? If you're within a national park or bordering a national forest or BLM land, ecosystems don't understand these political boundaries, right? Bugs can get into the forest, fire can cross these lines. Certainly climate change is not stopping at a boundary of an Indian reservation. This layout of the land necessitates partnership building if we're thinking about ecosystems as larger than just political landscape boundaries. Going back to sort of this broad idea, our tribes are managing for goals. What are some of those goals? Well, there's materials for cultural activities. There's economic goals. You can see this picture here with the chainsaw that's on the Menominee Reservation. Forestry is jobs, it's healthcare, it's education for people, it supports families. That's really important to have that. Forestry also helps provide the opportunity to do restoration. If you don't have a sawmill and you can't get money for doing forest management, it's going to be really hard to restore forests. Some of these cultural activities here, you see birch bark canoe. This gentleman is making a winnowing basket for wild rice out of birch bark. And again, you see this is like ecology, economy, and culture all coming together. Wild rice is cultural, it's spiritual, but it's also economic. It supports our families in many different ways, physically feeding us, but also the ability to sell that too, right? And make actual money that you can use to buy something else or to support the education or healthcare of your children. So other things that lands are managed for, the hunting and fishing, of course, spirituality, religious, sacred sites, that kind of stuff. So these lands are managed for many, many purposes, and they have been over time. All lands in the United States were once tribal lands, period. And I'll get into this a little bit more, but the tribes are governments, and they have been around before the United States was a country. That concept there, that the tribes are sovereign governments and were here before the United States, is a key concept when we start thinking about public land management and our relationships with tribes. So all those lands that are national forest, all those lands that are BLM, national park, those lands were all tribal lands at one point. And I challenge all of us to understand, if you're working in an area, to learn about how that land became national forest, national park, BLM land. Look at the treaties, look at information. And actually, if you go to the U.S. Forest Service, the Office of Tribal Relations, if you just type in U.S. Forest Service Office of Tribal Relations and scroll down to the bottom of that first page, you'll see something called Tribal Connections. It's a GIS map that you can click on any place in the lower 48 and see what treaties were signed in that location. It links to the text of those treaties, maybe one, maybe multiple. It shows you the original tribes that signed it. So it might say Potawatomi, but now we have multiple Potawatomi tribes, and it shows you the current day tribe. So it would say my tribe, Citizen Potawatomi Nation, comma, Forest County Potawatomi, comma, Prairie Band, whatever that the current tribal governments are. And that way you can understand and start seeing who you might need to work with or learn from as you're working on these public lands. Okay, with that as sort of a background, I'm going to switch gears here to understanding our obligations to tribes and public land management. And to do that, I'll talk a little bit about treaties, and I'll talk about this idea of the federal trust responsibility. So tribal sovereignty is this concept that tribes were governments before the United States. They're sovereign governments. So this idea, that's tribal sovereignty. Just like the United States is a sovereign country, Canada's sovereign, France is sovereign, tribes are sovereign. Right? And this concept of sovereignty is enshrined in the US Constitution. So our earliest founding document of the United States recognizes tribal sovereignty and tribes. It's recognized in case law. This tribal sovereignty is recognized in executive orders. It's presidential executive orders. It's recognized in departments and agencies and the regulations and policy. So I know most about the Forest Service. We have policies around how do we consult with tribes. All of this supports tribal sovereignty, or I would say affirms tribal sovereignty from the United States government perspective. This gives us this government to government trust responsibility. Right? Again, government meaning the United States, meaning also to government. The other government is the tribal government. And these things, the United States Constitution, case law, executive orders, the treaties, those all form this trust responsibility. So the government has particular responsibility to tribes. And this is why, because tribes are sovereign governments, this is why tribes are not stakeholders. It's not like the snowmobile group or the timber harvest community. Tribes are separate governments. And because it's in the Constitution, because it's in departmental regulations, et cetera, the government is legally required to work with tribes on any sort of decision. I'm getting ahead of myself here, but that's the government to government trust responsibility. And this all comes because these governments were here before the United States. When the treaties were signed, they were signed government to government. And the treaties, the way those are looked at is that treaties is essentially, if it was written down that the tribe ceded land, it had to be specific. What rights were they ceding to the government? And what rights do they retain? Sometimes it would say we retain the right to hunt, fish, and gather in the treaty. We will let you settle on this land. We will give this land to the United States, but we reserve the right to hunt, fish, and gather. And then any right that wasn't explicit in a treaty, the courts have said that it's retained by the tribe. So tribes have a lot of rights that are inherent to the tribal sovereign government through these treaties. Oops, I clicked the wrong button. There we go. So this federal trust responsibility, we're talking about federal lands here. All these agencies, every federal agency is required to consult with tribes on any decision that they make, any program that they have, anything that they do that the tribes might have interest in. They're required by law to do that. And it's based on this tribal sovereignty that I just discussed. The treaties are also, and the reserved rights within those treaties, either explicit or not written down, are also legal responsibilities that the federal government needs to provide. This doesn't always happen. It hasn't always happened, but consistently the courts have affirmed this. And we're seeing more and more movement with, again, the Forest Service establishing an Office of Tribal Relations to deal with all of this. They don't legally have to have an Office of Tribal Relations, but they legally have to consult with tribes and to uphold the treaty rights. And so the Office of Tribal Relations was established to help the Forest Service do that. Now, Park Service has something similar. I'm not sure about the BLM, but I'm sure if they don't have one, they certainly have people that work on these issues because it's required. It's legal. Now, I dug in a little bit in Idaho here to kind of, I guess, orient myself on this. And I was looking, I think it was the environmental impact statement for the forest plans for the Boise, Payette, and Sawtooth National Forest. This is what it says in that EIS. The Nez Perce, Shoshone-Bannock, and Shoshone-Paiute interest in the three national forests goes beyond that of spiritual and cultural to the unique legal relationships that the United States government has with American Indian tribal governments. That's what I just described. That's the government-to-government trust responsibility. It's in their plans. Plans are, so you have the law, or your constitution, law, agency policy and regulations. Then these plans are developed with all of that as a background. They all have to be in agreement. And so here it is coming out in this forest plan. I looked a little bit at this is also from the plan. So they quote the Treaty of 1855, and it says the right of taking fish at all usual and accustomed places in common with the citizens of the territory. That's that right to hunt and fish is reserved for the tribes. They can not only hunt and fish, but they could build temporary buildings for the purpose of, essentially drying the fish, smoking the fish, etc. They have the privilege of hunting, gathering roots and berries, and pasturing their horses and cattle upon these open and unclaimed lands. Unclaimed, I think, I don't know Idaho that well. I don't know these treaties that well, but I'm assuming that unclaimed means like a farmer wasn't settling on it. A homesteader wasn't on that land. And so all these public lands are essentially this open and unclaimed land. Tribes have a right to do this. They said, United States, you can have this land for settlement. We retain these rights. These were explicit. Remember I said, if a treaty is explicit, we have to follow that. But if it doesn't say anything, the right is retained. So something that's kind of new-ish, that's going to be important as we move forward with climate change, water. What does water say in this treaty? It's not there explicitly, at least in this section that I'm reading. And again, I don't know these treaties that well, so maybe it's in there. But think about it, if the tribes saw water as something that they would have had access to, and that they weren't giving away their right to that water in the treaty, it wasn't written down, the tribes retain that right. That's retained treaty rights. Anyway, Shoshone-Bannock 1868 treaty, it says, they shall have the right to hunt on the unoccupied lands of the United States, so long as game may be found thereon, and so long as peace subsists among the whites and Indians on the borders of the hunting districts. So there's a clear understanding of where the tribes were hunting as these treaties were being made. And the tribes retain that right. A lot of these treaties, aside from ceding land, it was this idea of friendship, that there wouldn't be war with the United States government. So there were treaties of friendship. In another presentation, I show a friendship medal that was given to the Menominee in one of their treaty negotiations to say, look, we're friends with the United States. So you see that peace, friendship come up in these treaties as well. So that's a background, right? If you don't remember anything else, the federal government has to work with tribes, period. So then the question becomes, how do we do that in a good way? How do we do that and manage our public lands, right? So this is now I'm switching gears into the public partnerships with tribes. And this is kind of segmented in two. One is the first study that I did that you probably read on Forest Service tribal liaisons. And then the second one is our new work with the Wild Rice Project. So in order to understand partnerships with tribes, I think it's important to step back and understand the different sort of tribal institutions that you might form partnerships with. right? There's the tribal governments, and that's what I've been really talking about up to this point. The federal government has a responsibility to the tribal government as the official representation of the sovereign nation. Makes sense. But there are also institutions. So things like tribal colleges, probably chartered by the tribe, forming partnerships with them, or like I led a partnership with the Forest Service and a tribal college for almost a decade. There's a Forest Service employee with the Salish Kootenai College in Montana, and she's fostering that partnership. Those are very good partnerships, very productive for land management. It's not tribal consultation. It's not the official tribal government. So it doesn't necessarily fulfill the federal government's obligation to work with tribes. It could add to it and help, but it's not the tribal government. There's also like the resource management departments that the tribes have. You can form partnerships with them. Some tribes even have their own separate sort of board of directors for those resource management departments. But again, that's not necessarily the tribal government. The tribal government could delegate responsibility to the Department of Natural Resources, but they don't have to. So who are you making the partnership with? Is it the tribal government? Is it a tribal institution? And then you have these things like these treaty rights groups. So as the tribes have been exerting their or reclaiming their rights that were not ceded in the treaties or explicitly named out in the treaties, like hunting, fishing, gathering, oftentimes those treaties were signed by more than one tribe. Those tribes at the moment come together in these treaty rights groups, typically after a court case where the tribes have successfully sued to get access to those resources. And then these management groups help manage the natural resources in those treaty areas. So for example, the Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission includes the Nez Perce as one of the tribes. And typically this is another point when I talk about tribal institutions and who are you making a partnership with. These treaty rights groups, by definition, are working off reservation, because that's where those treaties, those ceded rights are coming into play. They have specific rights to their reservation, and to manage that will typically have a tribal Department of Natural Resources. But these treaty rights groups are outside those reservation boundaries. And that's something that I think gets confusing sometimes to people. So I just highlight it there. But again, the question is, who are you making a partnership with? Here's just a shot of the website for the Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission. And I was actually fortunate enough one time when I was out at Warm Springs looking at some of their forestry operations, and they had their annual meeting, and it was in Portland, as I recall. And I got to attend the banquet, and it was wonderful. It was great. They had a youth group that did some theater around fishing and boarding schools. Very powerful. It was great to hear the tribal leaders talking about the accomplishments that they had and the goals that they have. If you look on their website, I don't know. I assume you probably know about this and work with them a lot, so you know a lot more than I do. There's other institutions, and this is just I throw this out there. We've got the federal government. I've talked about that. Bureau of Indian Affairs. Again, if we think about like on and off reservation, typically Bureau of Indian Affairs, and specifically their forestry division, they work on the reservation. That's reservation forest land. That 18 million acres that I mentioned at the beginning, that's reservation forest land. That's not the national parks, national forests, which you can imagine. I would argue that all those national parks and national forests should be included when we think of what is tribal land, because they have all those retained rights. And on top of that, even if they didn't have a treaty, the federal government has a responsibility to manage in consultation with the tribes. The Idaho government, state government, there's an Idaho Council on Indian Affairs. That's something to look up and see what they're doing and saying and how they're working. And then there's non-governmental organizations. As Tess said in the beginning, I work with the Intertribal Timber Council. That's a bunch of tribes coming together around Indian forestry. And it's also the Forest Service and Bureau of Indian Affairs are really involved in that as well because of this trust responsibility. If you're interested in agriculture, there's an Intertribal Agriculture Council. National Congress of American Indians is a broad group, a very long-standing group that advocates for tribal sovereignty and rights. And then right at your own university, there's the Intertribal Native Council. I believe that's a student group. I looked at their Facebook. It seems like they're super active. I'd recommend just kind of checking out what they're doing. Probably have powwows on campus, which are good. And I'll get into why that's important in a moment, you'll see. But, I'm sure they have powwows on campus. There might be events where their community members are invited and food, etc. And then there's Native American and Indigenous Studies. I think you can get a minor. I wasn't sure if you could get a major, but I didn't dig too deeply in that. That all of this is to say that when we're talking about building partnerships, there's multiple avenues to build partnerships. And it's really important to understand where you're making that partnership. So here you have just some symbols, the Nez Perce and the Shoshone-Bannock tribes at Fort Hall. Those are the federally recognized tribes. The federal government has that responsibility with those tribes. You could have the Intertribal Timber Council. Like I said, these tribes come together, and you could form a partnership with the Intertribal Timber Council. You could have a partnership with the Tribal College. It looked like the closest was probably Salish Kootenai. And then you have those intertribal treaty groups. And those treaty groups are more, those are direct representations of the tribal governments. Okay, who are you? The idea with this is, who are you making a partnership with? Okay, let me just check my time real quick. All right, we're doing great. Now I'm going to just talk about this paper, and then I'll talk about the other paper. So it's artificially separated. There are some different, I guess, lessons learned or concepts coming out of both of them, but essentially it's all fairly similar. So what we did in this, actually, let me go back one. What we did on this paper is we interviewed, we asked all of the Forest Service employees that have part of their duty, their job duties, to work with tribes, if they would do an interview with us. At this time, we, in 2018, or it was a little bit before that when we did it, there were about 36, as I recall, employees that either had full-time or part-time tribal relations duties. The Washington office of the Forest Service has an office of tribal relations. There's a handful of people there. I don't know how much you went into Forest Service and how they're set up, but each region of the National Forest System has a regional forester, they're called, and typically there would be tribal relations staff in that regional office. And then each national forest would maybe have one or share a tribal liaison, depending on how much work they do with tribes. So we asked all these folks how they approach partnership building. There's a higher representation of Native American employees that do these jobs. So I think out of that 36, or out of the ones we interviewed, about half of them were tribal members themselves. Most of them had long experience with the Forest Service. And there was pretty good gender balance with the people that we talked about, or that we interviewed. And this is what they told us. First of all, that one strategy is formal relationships. And this goes back to that government to government consultation. There needs to be a formal relationship. And one way to do that is a memorandum of understanding. So formal agreements that the Forest Service will sign with the tribe, the tribal government, that says, how do we implement this partnership? The Forest Service, I know mostly about the Great Lakes, but we have official MOUs with the treaty rights organizations. So it says, how are we managing these national forests for the treaty rights that we're responsible for? But these are formal agreements. And pretty much everyone that we interviewed said these are really important and they form a really good foundation for working together in partnership. But you can't just have a formal agreement. There has to be more. And one of the things that's more that helps these partnerships is developing personal relationships with the tribal communities you're working in. And this is why I said powwows. How do you do that? One thing, go to powwow. Show up at the tribal community. There's if community events that are open to all, maybe see what the natural resource departments are doing. They might need volunteers. I know on Menominee, there's oftentimes the biologist would need volunteers to do bear counts and things, to different wildlife surveys. You know, just get involved and start building those personal relationships. Another way that can happen is when you're at a meeting. You know, as a federal employee, when I was a federal employee, our day is done right at 4:30. You could easily say, okay, it's 4:30, I'm gone, see you later. No, hang around, have some coffee, go, you know, have dinner together, get to know each other, to demonstrate that you're there to work with them and really develop those personal relationships. Another strategy that goes along with this is this idea of building respect and trust through listening. And here's just a quote that I thought was really good. I think it's all of our responsibility to listen once in a while, not just talk at people. I sort of became a professor, I think, because I like talking. So for me, it's hard. I have to consciously, okay, I've got all this stuff happening in my brain. I need to quiet myself and really listen to try to understand what people are telling us. I do a lot of climate change meetings, and inevitably tribes in climate change, somebody will stand up and start talking about the atmosphere, which leads to the ozone layer, which leads to discussions about garbage that's dumped down a road. And within the context of climate change, the ozone is very different. I should say Western concepts of climate change. Ozone is different. That's different chemicals. We dealt with that through laws and policies. Not happening anymore. Garbage dumping down the road. What does that have to do with anything? If I don't really listen, and I've seen climate scientists kind of scrunch up their eyebrows and say, you don't know what you're talking about. We're talking about carbon. We're counting carbon here. Well, that's an example of not listening, because what the people are saying when they make comments like that is our relationship with the earth is broken. Climate change is a symptom of our problem of not having a good relationship, and it's all the same. Once we solve that relationship issue, our problems with climate change will be easier to solve because we will understand what we need to do, how we need to live in order to rectify that problem. And it's the same problem as garbage and people not respecting and littering, and it's the same problem within ozone. And so if you really step back and listen, that's a way to build those partnerships, because then you're starting to hear and understand a different perspective on what natural resources are and what our goals are for management. Okay, another one is this idea of getting our leadership involved. And here you see one of the former chiefs of the Forest Service with the president of the College of Menominee Nation. Both those leaders, they were together. They were saying this partnership is important. And when the leaders say that, it all follows. I'm just a lonely employee doing my job and trying to build partnerships with tribes, that's great, that's necessary. But once the leadership steps in and says, this is important, and actually demonstrates that it's important. So it's demonstrating leadership, showing up in these events, in these spaces on tribal land to make these partnerships or acknowledge these partnerships. That goes a long way to build partnership. And then finally, this is one of my favorites, and I think this one, it goes hand in hand with getting support from the agencies, building personal relationships, but it's basically doing projects together. Tribes have reservation land that isn't going to change. Those boundaries are staying the same when all of this change is happening around. The national forest boundary is not going to change that much, right? And so actually doing projects together is a way. I hear tribal members saying, walk the land together. I've adapted this, and I'll show you in a moment, our wild rice project is to canoe the waters together. When we're out in the woods walking around and sharing our own, building our own personal relationships with each other and with the land, that really builds partnership. You can really start to understand the tribal perspective, and you're out on the land together. So that's a really important partnership building strategy. Work on projects together. Tribes have a lot of projects they want to be working on. And just like every institution, they don't necessarily have the resources to do it all. So working on things together is really important. Okay, now I'm going to get into some of the lessons from our wild rice project. Kawe Gada Nanaga Dewindaman, Monoman. That means first we must consider the wild rice. And that our project name it's in Ojibwe, and it was named by one of our tribal partners, family members. And basically this is the whole idea that if we make decisions that positively impact wild rice, that will positively impact the entire ecosystem and our communities as part of that ecosystem. So tribes, including Potawatomi in this Great Lakes region, we have a long history of relationship with wild rice. In fact, our tribes have migration stories that we came from the East Coast through the St. Lawrence Seaway and the Great Lakes, looking for where the food grows on the water. That's wild rice. Wetland crop, wetland plant, grows in the water. And this cultural connection is extremely strong, but it's also an economic thing. It encompasses a lot of our tribal ways. And it's not only a past thing, but it's a present. So here's one of the tribes in Minnesota, the Fond du Lac tribe, going out to do some wild rice restoration. Here's from our project, some of the tribal members working with our students to make winnowing baskets, which you saw in an earlier slide, to winnow the wild rice. Here's a student learning how to make a knocking stick. You use sticks, as you saw in that earlier photo or the drawing, to harvest the wild rice. So it's not only a past thing, it's a very contemporary part of tribal life. And we got together with the tribes because we're seeing declines in wild rice across the range. So Michigan has a really bad problem where the rice is quite diminished from its historical range. It's degraded on many places, and many of the tribes don't have access to it anymore in Michigan. Wisconsin is kind of in the middle where there is a lot of degradation, but there's still some. And then Minnesota is fairly healthy so far, although there's some negative impacts that are starting to feed in. So the tribes really came to the University of Minnesota, and we started talking about, well, what can we do? The University of Minnesota has a lot of resources, a lot of people and money to do these kind of projects. So we came together, and these are some of the perspectives on partnership building that come out of our project. Again, it's in that second paper. But one strategy that comes out is this idea of acknowledging past and present harms. That's really important because these are issues that are long-standing with our tribal communities. In our case, I got my University of Minnesota shirt on. The University of Minnesota had been doing work to develop wild rice cultivars that could be bred for essentially commercial agriculture. And the tribes have been against that for a number of reasons. Then the university started looking at the genetics once that technology started coming into play, and the tribes were really against that. And so they've sent letters, they've done formal things against the University of Minnesota. But that past and then present, because some of that work continues, harm is you need to acknowledge that. And if you don't, there's no building that partnership. It doesn't mean you have to solve the problem. But I think acknowledging the problem makes me an advocate, makes every University of Minnesota employee on my team an advocate for tribal perspectives and getting tribes involved in discussions around genetics and wild rice. That's acknowledging past and present harms. That's important. That's for us in our Monoman, our wild rice project, that's key. Another one is to really collaborate as equals. So in this case, respecting that tribal knowledge that tribal members and natural resource departments have around wild rice management, that's extremely important. Recognize and respect tribal labor, and then tribal goals for management. So that's really working as equals. And we let the tribal Department of Natural Resources, basically, we got together. We had listening sessions for about a year and a half. How can we work together? We know this is harmful. We know that the university has not always been on your side, but we see a future where we could work together to help your goals. So let's talk about what your goals are and how do we incorporate your knowledge in that. An example of that, here's a picture of a dam. This is a past and present harm because the tribal members are saying to us that this particular dam is negatively impacting wild rice. And that in fact, if we're doing a wild rice project, we should be sampling over in a different area around this dam because they think the dam is having an impact. Our hydrologists, certainly dams change the hydrology of the system, but that wasn't a site that I think we would have sampled that in our project. But really listening and acknowledging that tribal perspective and that deep tribal knowledge, that means, okay, yeah, we will sample here. That wasn't in our original plan or how we would have thought about it. And lo and behold, this is helping the scientists that do the water part of our project really understand the system a lot better than if they wouldn't have sampled where the tribes were telling us. Another thing in this one is that tribal labor. I said respect tribal labor. There's another shot of that airboat from the Tribal Natural Resource Department. They have small staffs, limited resources, and we need to respect their time, their effort, and their labor in these endeavors. It might be as simple as paying people to come to a meeting to talk about wild rice, or as complex as in all of our grants now, we ask our tribal partners, what can we put in here to support your work? So whether it's buying equipment or paying people salaries to do the surveys, what is it? And some of our partners want, money, cash from the grants. Some of them don't, but at least having that discussion and recognizing your labor, your knowledge is important. And we're just like I get money out of a grant, you should get money too. Okay. Here's another one. This kind of goes along with the formal agreements and the leadership that I talked about in our earlier project. But basically, it's that developing formal agreements, and in particular, in this case, developing data protocols for what we're collecting. So we have formal agreements that lay out how data is going to be collected, how data is going to be used, and who owns that data. Because tribes are sovereign, their knowledge is sovereign, we need to respect that and get agreements up front. The woman that's sort of looking at the camera in the middle there, she's the president of the University of Minnesota. And the woman next to her speaking is a tribal chairperson. The two women on the right of the president of the university are Minnesota Department of Natural Resource leaders. Like one is the head of the Pollution Control Agency and the other one is the head of, I can't remember right now, but basically leaders. These are the leadership coming together, tribes, university, state government, to really talk about these data protocols and establish agreements, formal agreements. So you don't have to read all this, but I just needed to show you. We developed this research protocol that we sign with our tribal partners. And they tell us who signs it. They say, do our tribal council sign it? Does our natural resource department sign it? But essentially, we want to say that highlighted part, any research conducted with the communities on tribal lands, they have full consent of the tribe, however they want to do that approval. Those are formal agreements that really help us do our research. in a way that respects tribal sovereignty and in a way that respects tribal data. Okay. Another strategy, I just have this one and then another one, and then we can open it up to talk. But it's this is the same one we saw. This is building those personal relationships. That's one of our student interns in the bow of the canoe, and in the stern is one of our tribal partners. Right, you can see the smiles on their faces. This is that canoeing the land, the water together. Right? There's no way you can build personal relationships around natural resources if you're not out there walking around together, if you're not in the areas that you're talking about. I do a lot of planning in meeting rooms, right, inside. That works for some things, but it doesn't work for really what we need to exchange knowledge, goals, objectives, etc. So this personal relationships you saw in the last project was important, and in this project as well. How do you do that? Powwows I mentioned. Food is another one. Here's our research team with our student interns eating lunch together at one of our sites where we were sampling water. I think pretty much any tribal partnership and personal relationship that or a tribal event that you go to is going to have food. I'm not sure exactly about what it looks like out in Idaho, but I would assume that food is also very important. So whether it's eating salmon or berries or something else, that's going to form part of a way to build that relationship. And I already mentioned the powwows, and that's the same picture. I also like this picture as a quick aside of diversity, right? I just see lots of colors, lots of different people. Our tribes are diverse internally as well. And then finally, this is the final strategy that we've come up with in our program. It's navigating these institutional barriers. It's tough. Yeah, not everything's going to work. Even the data protocols, that's going to take a long time to set up. It's going to take, possibly you don't have leaders that support it, but you need to really build support from leadership. And then tribal partnerships are long-term. Tribes aren't going anywhere. Our institutions, for the most part, aren't going anywhere either. Boise State's going to continue. The Forest Service is going to continue. So we have to look at these things as long-term. That's how tribes understand the world. They've been here for thousands of years before the Forest Service, for example, and they're going to be here into the future. So we need to look at these as long-term things, not just project by project. A project can get us working together, get us forming these relationships, but these need to be long-term. And so we need to navigate the institutions that we work in so that they understand that. Okay. And the final, just as a bonus strategy, is get native and non-native students involved. We have all sorts of non-native and native students that work on our projects, and it's been wonderful. Our tribal partners say, we want our students involved. We want students to learn about this. So me giving this talk to your class right now is fulfilling our partnership goals of educating students. Because the more students that you can learn this during your class time, the better you can work with tribes once you get out. So just in conclusion, collaboration, partnership building. Who are you making the partnerships with? Individual tribes, treaty rights groups, tribal colleges and universities. And in fact, our Monoman project has all of those. Meet the tribes by walking the land on their terms. Develop research protocols. And I didn't say this, but giving back to the community is also really important. The research needs to be given back in a way that the tribes can use it. And then all of this is predicated on respecting tribal sovereignty. So with that, there's my son with a little fish and my daughter. Miigwech, thank you. And let's open it up to the discussion now. I think I hit it right on the dot.
That was perfect. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Mike. Please join me and either silently or loudly thanking Mike for his amazing presentation and teaching us so much. There have been a number of really exciting chat questions. I think we'll go ahead and start with Alyssa, Wolf, and Eli had some questions about species reintroduction that didn't seem to come up in the talk at all. And maybe Alyssa, if you want to ask the first part of that, and Eli, you could add on anything that you wanted additionally.
Yeah, so I was just curious if you knew about the extent of collaboration and partnerships between tribal governments and federal or state agencies on species reintroduction, like the gray wolf reintroduction in Yellowstone. That was a big one.
I don't know too much about it, but I know it's really important. And we have wolf issues here in the Great Lakes as well, and our tribes. So we have the states will have hunting seasons kind of up and down, depending on the Endangered Species Act at the time. Many of our tribes are against wolf hunting, and so forming those partnerships to talk about that is important. I know that wolves were reintroduced as well, and that tribes need to be involved in that. So at a broad level, any federal decision, so if we're talking about introductions into national parks or any federal land, or obviously if there are federally listed species, tribes have to be involved, period. They have to be consulted with these things. And I think that they are in these cases, but yeah, sorry, I don't know too much about the reintroductions.
We heard a few weeks ago, actually, from a wolf expert that the Idaho Fish and Game refused to allow wolves to be reintroduced on their property. And so the Nez Perce said, we'll do it. And so the reintroduction into Yellowstone was sort of took that route. So I think that's in part a follow-up. And I wanted to mention as well, you talked about the Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission, and Jamie Pinkman, who's the executive director, will be our last guest speaker. So he's, I think, going to talk about how salmon is where the health of the salmon is the health of the tribes in the Columbia River. So that's part of what we have up and coming. Eli, was there a follow-up there on species that you had? You had a slightly different take on the question. Was there anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, I was kind of just wondering if you knew of any like actual events that were being taken place, either past or present, from different tribes that are advocating for reintroduction of species.
Yeah, so one of them that I just had, my students, I had them do kind of I had them searching for these intertribal treaty groups. And one of them that we found was really interesting. I'm not going to name it right, but it's an intertribal treaty group around buffalo. And the tribes themselves, I don't know that much about it, because we literally just had a student presentation for 5 minutes on it, but it was really cool because it's an organization among different tribes, both in the US and Canada, around reintroduction of buffalo. And they form it around this idea of a treaty. Yeah, Intertribal Buffalo Council. That's really a cool one. I think that's worth looking at. And the idea of the wolf reintroduction, I've seen that in Wisconsin. So we've had wolf releases on the Menominee Reservation, and then the biologists really get together and they collar the wolves so they can kind of try to understand the range and what they're doing. I've seen wolf on the Menominee Reservation, which is kind of cool. It's not that far from Green Bay, so it's, to have wolves there, it was pretty neat. In fact, they often would run from the Menominee Reservation down to Green Bay, which was not as much habitat down there in the city, but
right.
Track them. You also have sturgeon is another fish that we look at reintroduction, particularly with dams. It's a similar story with salmon, where you have dams blocking passage, yet above the dam there's still some habitat that they could live in. And I think long term, really getting to a better understanding of how to either remove the dams or allow the fish to pass by them in a way that doesn't negatively impact them. Yeah, the buffalo one was pretty cool. A lot of tribes think about treaties, and we're starting to see some of this in the scholarship, I think. But a lot of tribes talk about other nations and treaties as extending to animal nations, plant nations, fish nations, etc. And so a traditional kind of tribal worldview we are all part of this ecosystem together. We have our human nations, but we have certain obligations, rights, and responsibilities with regard to other nations. So the horse nation, buffalo nation, salmon nation, etc. And that's a really interesting way to think about the world as well as we move forward with reintroduction or restoration of ecosystems and dealing with invasive species, fire, and climate change, etc.
Absolutely, and that reciprocity that needs to be figured into planning and management. I think that that question echoes nicely with what Alyssa Molis asked, which is had to do with the obligation, what happens when the obligations aren't met in the treaty requirement. So Alyssa, can you go ahead and ask that how you would like to?
Yeah, I think you did a pretty good job wording it. I'm just kind of wondering if there's any sort of like reimbursement or something for like when Native American rights like aren't being met, like the hunting and fishing stuff. Like if there's something that we do, or I don't know. Yeah.
So typically what has happened is either there's kind of two ways. Again, I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not 100% versed in all the law, but there's a couple ways these cases end up in court. And court is really what kind of sets the stage for how the resources are managed, the treaty rights are managed after the court cases. So one, the tribes themselves can basically just sue and say, you're not giving us access to treaty resources. Whether that's, usually it's a state, because the way we manage our wildlife, right, it's state. The states are really in charge of water and wildlife. And so here in the Great Lakes, for example, or Pacific Northwest, some of those treaty cases, it's like the state isn't letting the tribes harvest in, like you saw in the treaty that I mentioned, in their usual and accustomed places. So the tribes can either sue directly or they get arrested doing it. And they do that sometimes on purpose, right? To get the court case moving. Like they'll go out and fish out of season or without the state permits that the state wants. And that gets into court. And then through that, they determine the remedies. So it might be money. There's also something called Indian Land Claims Commissions, Indian Land Claims, and that's a longer process that had to do explicitly with identifying land and the United States government's obligation to pay for that land. So you might hear that the Black Hills are not ceded or settlements that the U.S. government offered the tribes that had that as their traditional land that was taken from them in violation of the treaties. And the tribes don't want the money, they want the land. So there's this bank account that just accrues. There's billions of dollars at this point, or $1 billion, but the tribes don't want that land. In other cases, the tribes might use money to do certain things. And this goes back to each tribe is different. How they think about these things, what agreements they have with the US government after the treaties. So some tribes get money and take money for different programming. Some tribes don't. Sometimes there's a mixture. I was going to say, I recommend reading a book called Blood Struggle, Charles Wilkinson. I assign that to my graduate and undergraduate students. I think it's a wonderful, he's a lawyer, so there's a lot of law in there, but it's all natural resource based. It really gives a broad overview of how tribes are thinking about this. And you'll see examples of tribes taking money and doing things with it and tribes not taking money, among other things. It's a really good book, and it's a pretty easy read in terms of it's not like reading a law review article, which is difficult if you've ever looked at one.
We read some of his Crossing the Next Meridian the first couple of weeks of class, so sort of classic. I had a question about, and then there are more student questions, but this is kind of relevant to the point that you just made. You mentioned that there were new tribes that were applying for status sort of all the time, and that there's continual kind of growth in that. And it made me wonder how frequently treaties were renegotiated or treaties were amended, because the references that you brought out for Idaho were the origin of the treaties. But I was wondering if the treaties served more sort of like the U.S. Constitution, and that the amendments come few and far between, but the sort of application of them is constantly adjudicated.
Yeah, the application changes in favor of the tribes, but there's no sort of renegotiating the treaties at this point. I forget the last treaty that was made. but it was quite a while ago.
Interesting.
100+ years ago. We don't do treaties anymore with the tribes, as the U.S. government doesn't do more treaties with the tribes. But there is that, how do we interpret, and it's particularly with resource scarcity, you start seeing claims come up about it. Is there not enough fish, or you're not letting us fish? And this, you see in that blood struggle book, is really good, because you see the tribes gaining political and economic power, and this is now the tribes are able to confront some of these long-standing issues of being denied treaty rights.
Right, thank you. There are a number of really good questions that are still out there. Jessica, I think you had one about tribal demands of the U.S. government, and Daniel, you had a great question about antiquities management, and Leif, you had one too on inclusivity. So if any of you wants to jump in there, or if there was one of our guests, we probably have time for one or two more questions.
I can go if no one else wants to.
Thanks, Leif.
So yeah, my question was, I've observed many instances recently when Western approaches for environmental issues start to fail. It seems like that's when collaboration with tribes is more likely to ensue. I've noticed this with, I watched a film on the dams, and it seemed like once we started to realize our approach wasn't working, that's when they would reach out and start to collaborate with those tribes and see what they thought was best. I was just curious if you've noticed this trend, and if you think, or how you think we could start to shift the narrative of environmental solutions to be more inclusive, if not reliant on tribal knowledge in the first place.
I think that's an astute observation. I don't think I've ever contextualized it in that way, but I think you're totally right, 100% right. Things like fire raging in uncontrollable ways that hasn't happened before. When we're talking about the tribes with fire, what's now? It wasn't before. And so I think there's a lot of validity to what you're saying there. And how do we get out of it? Well, one, we have these massive problems that we're trying to deal with now. So it brings in a lot more opportunity for these partnerships to solve the problems. But I think moving forward, I believe that once we have these strong partnerships and we see the value in it, we'll start to shift to be more proactive in how we work together. For example, in research, we're not totally there yet with research. I think we're further along with thinking about partnerships on the land itself than we are within the universities doing the research that then supports that land management. So as we start seeing more and more partnerships forming, more and more positive outcomes, more and more our science will realize that we can really all move forward in our understanding of the world if we work together, that we can move forward in a more impactful manner by incorporating different perspectives into our science. It'll just be a positive feedback loop. So my thought is that as we form more and more partnerships out of necessity, we will start seeing the value, and then that those will transform into more proactive partnerships.
Awesome, thank you.
Fantastic. Well, we are about out of time, but Mike, if I could ask you to stay on for a little bit, if there are some lingering questions. I know we have a couple guests in the audience today, and there were a couple student questions that we didn't get to, but many of our students have another class after this that they need to make their way to. So please join me again in thanking Mike for his contributions today and for a really enlightening and illuminating talk. So thank you so much for doing that. And thank you all for your great questions as well.
Great. Thank you, everyone. This was really fun. Hopefully you enjoyed it.
Yeah, Mike, it was really fantastic. It was neat to see the trends when you're thinking about the different resources. I think the forestry versus the wild rice comparisons are really interesting. And like many of the students, I immediately thought of the salmon, and we've been hearing a lot about the work on the dams, and the potential for partnerships there is, I think, really exciting area.
And you know what's even more exciting? This, again, if I'm all about tribal sovereignty. If we really lean into that, the tribes have a lot of power there. Mm-hmm. And that can actually facilitate. There's always discussions in the U.S. Forest Service. Sometimes it's tongue in cheek where someone will say, well, we should give all the land back to the tribes. And why are people saying stuff like that? Because the tribes have been able to manage their reservation land fairly well.
Mm-hmm.
We talk about fire. I've been on, seen pictures, and I've been on tours out west. The Tule River tribe is one in particular where the Intertribal Timber Council bounces around to different reservations every year. And so you get to tour. So I was in California there, going to the Sequoia National Forest, really cool. I'm in awe. And then we crossed the tribal boundary, and I realized, and there were little cabins and stuff kind of in the woods. And we crossed the tribal boundary, and it's completely different. It's open. The sequoia groves are there, just like they were on the Forest Service, but there's nothing underneath. They had maintained that fire underneath the sequoias, whereas on the Forest Service just hadn't done that. And I instantly realized, one, I'm in Midwestern eyeballs on this ecosystem. I don't know what I'm looking at. Even though I've read about it and heard about it, I was like, this is cool. Look at that cabin, right? And two, the tribes are really managing it in a way that the Forest Service is almost envious of. So as we lean into that tribal sovereignty, I think we can make more progress in some of these issues. And in fact, I see that worldwide, globally. If we really foster indigenous sovereignty, indigenous control of territory, we will see a lot of positive benefits in the ecosystem. Not every tribe is ecologically minded. Not every tribe is going to have completely sustainable operations, and that's okay. But I think in general we see, and the research bears this out, where you have indigenous communities managing resources, you have greater diversity, biodiversity, you have better land management outcomes. And if we lean into tribal sovereignty here, I think it can really help with that.
That's a great insight. Yeah, absolutely. I've certainly seen it in Patagonia and Brazil. That's borne out. Community forestry in Mexico.
Yep.
Those examples. Jared, did you have a question or?
Well, I was wondering and I'm sure you know Kyle White. He's on my committee, published with him. I learned a lot from him, and he argues a lot about indigenous science being part empirical and descriptive, but very much so rooted in spiritual and cultural traditions. And of course, the objectivity of Western science doesn't recognize that sort of validity as a foundation. And we've got institutions, environmental management institutions, that are so, I guess, just intractably in debt to Western science. Do you see that right there, the inability to recognize spiritual, cultural aspects in these institutions, as a big obstacle to even just partnership, and both from a research and a management kind of viewpoint?
Yeah, I think a couple things. It is, the spirituality is a really important part. If we really listen and form those personal relationships, we'll start to understand a little bit about how that enters into indigenous science, right? So we don't necessarily have to have our Western institutions on that same sort of spiritual level. But if we're able to listen and understand where the tribal knowledge is coming from, that will help influence how the Western institutions are doing their work. So for example, that dam that I showed, sampling upstream from that dam was something that the scientists wouldn't have done if they just designed their study by themselves.
Yeah.
But listening, and the tribal knowledge, which is the spiritual connection with the system, is part of that, but also that observation. Just listening, it changed the science in such a way that it influenced how we did our Western objective type science. I think the other thing is, when you start forming relationships, you start to become more upfront about, why are you doing this work in the first place? Why did the forester become a forester and work for the Forest Service? Most likely they love the land. They have a spiritual connection with the land. or the animals or whatever that thing is that they're, that influence them to go out and study for many years of their lives to become a professional resource manager. It's not to get rich, I know that. And so if we're walking together, and forming those relationships, that spirituality, that connection, that deep tie to the land really becomes apparent. And I don't think any scientist is completely objective, right? And so once we start talking about that, seeing how it may or may not influence tribal management, that starts kind of breaking into the academy, to the Western institutions, public land management institutions. We're never going to mandate spiritual management of national forest land, but you think back, even the like John Muir and the founders of some of these places, Roosevelt, it was that spiritual connection that sort of let people set them up in the first place. They all have their flaws, and we're seeing that now. I get that, but it's infused in a way that maybe we haven't recognized in the past. But I think we're starting to understand that there's no pure objectivity anymore.
Yeah. What I loved about your talk is, and I don't know if you did this intentionally or not, it was so optimistic, right? It was so optimistic. And, in the face of course, the social conversations we're having as a whole in this nation. And I work on the ground and I'm from a ranch family that actually settled in this area and in these communities. And there's still this like really violent, we won the West, we get to decide what we do with it prevalence. I tend to be very pessimistic about I want the partnerships to happen, but I'm seeing the people that are required to happen. I'm working with them, and they're just so backwards, I'll just say, for lack of a better term. And I just loved the optimism. It really gives me hope, on different scales that I'm looking at, that there is this great work happening. I just really appreciated that myself. So thank you.
Yeah, no problem. I'm optimistic about things. And also that little tidbit, when I say tribes aren't going anywhere, we have issues out here where the tribes have lost a lot of their land through allotment. And so you still have the reservation boundary, but the tribe might own, let's say, 20% of it.
Yeah.
And the tribes in these situations, including my own tribe, have been buying back land over the years. And sometimes, like there's one in Wisconsin, there's a township that's really antagonistic with the Oneida tribe. And they're always bringing the tribe to court. There's always these court battles. And I kind of chuckle to myself because Oneida's not going anywhere. Eventually, they're going to buy back every piece of the land. And unfortunately, that township will be tribal land. Okay. That's tough to think about. If you're, the mayor of that little town, or I don't even know if it's a mayor or whatever the elected officials are, it's tough to think about. But, this might happen in 50, 100, 200 years. It's going to happen. The tribe is going to get their land back, and there's really no stopping that. And so, yeah, that's one scenario where the tribes have this long-term view. If we can get that township and other people to realize that, it's probably better to start building the strong partnerships now so that we move forward together rather than just being antagonistic. But, in some situations, it will be antagonistic until the tribe buys that last parcel.
Yeah.
And I think back to there was a question about the problems forcing the partnerships on us. I think we're going to see more and more of that. We don't have the money for the federal agencies don't have the money to do what they need to do. The tribes don't have the money that they need to do. None of us have all the people and money to do this landscape level management that we really need to confront these issues. And so we're going to, by necessity, get forced together to do it. But we will come together because we're not going to just sit around and watch everything go up in smoke, right? So these partnerships are going to help us. And as we see those partnerships working, this kind of happened with the fish stuff in the Great Lakes. I assume it's similar up in the Pacific Northwest, but I'm not as sure about that. But here in the Great Lakes, these treaty organizations are monitoring fish populations. We've got a good handle on what the fish are doing and what the tribal take is contributing to the population. And in fact, these intertribal agencies are helping restore the ecosystems in a way that's benefiting everybody. And it's super transparent at this point. And it's obvious that if we didn't have those tribal groups, we wouldn't be in as good a situation as we are in terms of restoration. And as people see that, oh, tribes aren't actually taking all the fish and killing the ecosystem. Okay, well, I see that with my own eyes now. Maybe I was off base about it.
Yeah.
And we see that, I think it's changing. There's always going to be people that don't, there's racism and it's deep, right? But those kind of views are on the margins.
I never want to say there's a positive to racism. I never want to actually say that. I have noticed in my communities, that being said, that kind of the noble nature in harmony type, very, very kind of racist, demeaning, othering sort of process has actually helped open people up to listening to tribes on resource management. It's like, oh, they know better. They know how to live in harmony with the land. It's like, well, if that's what it takes to listen, I guess then we can start forming some, more authentic dialogue than that really thinly deployed racism. So.
Yeah, I think the stereotypes there, well, we're starting to see too, as you learn a little bit more about other people, other cultures, which I think is happening in terms of tribes, because they're gaining this political, economic, and social standing, and they're winning. They basically win all these treaty rights cases pretty much every time they go through.
Oklahoma.
Yeah, so it's happening. People are seeing it, and we're starting to understand. Yeah, we're not inherently ecological, but understanding the world from a perspective that maybe the wild rice is my relative. I didn't put up a slide, but I often do, where I show and I ask the question: if you think if your culture really believes that the white pine is your relative or your grandfather, or this wild rice is your relative, you're going to treat that interaction that you have in a different way than if it's just a natural resource. Yeah. And so it's not really stereotypical. It's stereotypical if you say everyone believes that's tribal, because that's not true. But if you say that's a kind of a cultural value, that is true. Yeah. For most of the tribes.
This is very interesting. I want to go through my mind process right now. The fact that this is so optimistic, I think it goes back to that spiritual connection. We can all go out. This is why it's not mandated, right? The spirituality of living in your environment. It's not mandated because it just manifests itself. And then I had questions, and within like 4 minutes, you answered that question and you said it multiple times, and it was just amazing. And then I had other questions, but this process that we say, we can actually learn something, it's because there is this connection that happens without mandating it. And being out in these places, it's unity, really.
Yeah,
I have a very question that's been nagging now. So in terms of management, what practices on the land development, what are these tribes realizing? What kind of tools are they realizing to carry out these processes that we are lacking in I don't know, the U.S. Forest Service, or how do they differ from that?
I answer this question in a way that might be counterintuitive. So I work with forestry, with the foresters. The tribal foresters all went to forestry school, just like all the foresters.
Okay.
Yeah. They're not really using. There's certain techniques that foresters use, and they're not like the tribal guys have some special tool that they developed. But so the tools that foresters are using are pretty much the same. they're differing on the goals and why they're doing it. And so,
Okay, so okay, I mean, goals that's a tool, right? So let's go with goals. How are they orientating themselves on these goals versus some of these practices that are failing? How can we learn? What are we doing?
the one that I know from out by you all is the Umatilla First Foods Management Plan. I don't know if you've seen that. It's
I don't know.
So it's a
No.
forest plan. I'm a planner, so I collect plans and read plans, and I'm all about goals and objectives and plans. Well, this is a forestry plan that's called a First Foods Plan. The management objectives are to foster the first foods. And you read through this plan, and it's really cool. And it reminded me, I just had my students read this, so we talked about it a couple of weeks ago. But I remembered back to the Intertribal Fish Council meeting that I attended in Portland that I mentioned, and they had a feast, right? And I didn't know it at the time, but reading the First Foods Plan, the feast happened in a very particular manner. Where first it was water, then it was salmon, then it was, I believe, I can't get the order completely right. Then it was like elk, the big game. Okay. Then it went into like the roots, and then the berries at the end. The whole forestry plan is set up to foster that idea. And so like the management isn't for producing the most money through timber. The management is happening to foster each one of these things in turn. So those are sort of the touchstones for, is our management successful? Are we facilitating clean water? Is our management fostering healthy salmon populations? Are we, what are we doing with the wildlife habitat, et cetera? On Menominee in Wisconsin, and again, I worked there for a decade or so, and I still work with them. They're looking at, they have two main goals in their forest management plans. And this is long-standing goals. Foster diversity of species and high quality saw timber. Those are like the two things that override almost everything else. They revised their management plan a few years ago, and it brought more of a, I guess, interdisciplinary look at it. So now there's cultural goals and wildlife goals, et cetera. But anyway, the diversity of species gets all of that. If you have species that only grow after a fire, you're going to want to at least have some fire on the landscape so that those species will be there. You're going to want to have different age classes. So you're not going to have all the forests all the same age. So then, you don't have the younger forests. And what they say is we've been managing, and they're managing for high quality timber, which means healthy trees. They do leave cull trees and things like that. But when you manage for a healthy forest, you're continuously sort of like increasing the genetics on things, you're increasing the quality, which gives you a very, very healthy, diverse forest. And that gets all these other cultural goals wrapped up in it. It gets the healthy wildlife populations, which again, forestry for forestry's sake doesn't necessarily think about the wildlife. And it also provides jobs. So in the Menominee case, they have a sawmill that they're running. They have jobs of both loggers and people in the sawmill. And if you stopped cutting trees, basically that would devastate the local economy. Mm-hmm. And so, and some of the other things that they're doing, longer rotations. So rather than, a private, a paper company might be running, I don't know, a private timber company might have, let's just say 70-year rotation on a species. The Forest Service typically has a little bit longer rotations that I've seen. So we would have, let's just say 100 years for that same thing, white pine, for example. Menominee are going 120, 150 years. So a rotation length. They're growing bigger trees. You don't get as much money. Like when you look at the economic curve, you're sort of over the hump of getting more money for letting it keep growing, but you get that diversity. Yeah. They get bigger trees. They get really high quality timber from that too, right? You might not make as much money as you would cutting it at 100 years as you do letting it go to 125 or 130. But you get a bigger tree that can be used for certain things. So they're not trying to economically maximize everything. Even the sawmill, Menominee sawmill is something that they could modernize in certain ways that would eliminate jobs. And if you're just a regular private company, maybe you'd save on healthcare, et cetera. Maybe get a little bit higher quality because the laser can guide it a little bit better than the human eye. But that's not the goal. It's not maximizing profit. It's having profit. You need to be profitable. And in order to maintain jobs, because if you're not profitable, your company is going to go under. But maximizing profit is not the goal. And so those are just like minor tweaks. The sawmill runs like any other sawmill. The foresters do the same kind of thing. Maybe longer rotations is a little bit, I guess, taking that technique, but they're not harvesting in any crazy new way that nobody had ever thought of. Even the fire, it's like, well, I think
right on. It makes sense. It makes a whole lot of sense if you're going to continue to. So this is another question that came up after you discussed. The sovereignty is really what we want, is what tribes want to encourage people to realize. Would you say that sovereignty is established based on the use? Like if your use dictates, diversity, you're going to have all those trophic cascades happening and whatnot. Would you say that sovereignty is hinged upon the tribal's use of the lands? I mean, maybe.
Yeah. I don't know. I think for me, recognizing tribal sovereignty allows all of that to happen. So recognizing tribal sovereignty, the tribes themselves recognize that sovereignty, they're able to control their land. This might not be where you were going with it, but I often talk about tribes use their sovereignty to protect their territory. Tribes are using their sovereignty, in the case of Menominee, to develop forest management activities. They're using forestry to maintain their sovereignty. Forestry, in a sense, is a tool to maintain sovereignty. Some of my Menominee friends will say, if we were given the reservation that was on Green Bay itself, if we were essentially managing Green Bay, that would be the best fishery in the Great Lakes. Why? Because they would be using their sovereignty to support that. Fisheries would be supporting that sovereignty. I see it in my work in Bolivia, where indigenous communities are using forestry to maintain their territories. They're using that to support their own sovereignty. The goal is territorial sovereignty and all of what that entails, because the cascading, not only the sort of like trophic levels, as you've mentioned, but also our cultural connections are maintained through those relationships. Forestry has helped indigenous communities do that. I always say at the moment forestry isn't supporting that sovereignty, that territorial control, the indigenous communities will stop doing it. And I see that in the communities I work in Bolivia. Right? The forestry was really good in the mid 90s. That was the hope of the world for sustainable tropical forestry, was Bolivia. How do we do it there? Where did that start? Just like in the US, it started in indigenous communities getting certified for the first time. The first certifications in South America were in Bolivia in indigenous communities. Okay, then forestry, there was a very strong law. It was helping, the indigenous communities were following the law, supporting the law, doing the sustainable forestry. There were changes politically where the law is no longer enforced in the same way. It's no longer really supporting sustainable forestry. And so what do you see? You see these communities really kind of like backing off of some of that forest management because it's not helping with their sovereignty anymore. Again, if it was like a water thing or a fish thing, if they could use that as a way to maintain their control and their sovereignty, they would do that, and you'd see that. So for me, it's understanding sovereignty and then indigenous communities essentially using tools like forestry, natural resource management to support their sovereignty.
Right.
Thank you. Jessica or Leif for Daniel, did you have any other questions? Neat questions, Christopher. Thanks for
This is awesome.
sticking around and asking them. But I just want to make sure if you guys are listening, that's totally great. But if you had something you wanted to add or ask, please do.
I just want to ask like your thoughts on like the Dakota Access Pipeline.
Yeah, I have lots of thoughts on that. The main one that I always kind of come back to is we've heard from indigenous people across the globe that we need to stop using fossil fuels. And if you heard some of the stuff I was talking about in my presentation, listening to tribal voices and sometimes taking a leap of faith that they might know what they're talking about, we should do that. And in this case, indigenous people are uniting around this idea of we got to get off fossil fuels, period. And we need to listen to that. And indigenous communities over and over are telling us that. Dakota Access Pipeline is a symptom of our problems. It's not recognizing tribal sovereignty in a way that it probably should. It's not listening to the let's get off fossil fuels. And so, yeah, it's a manifestation of the majority society and kind of like our economy and how we're set up right now. It's not recognizing tribal sovereignty. It's not listening to indigenous voices. If you look at a map of pipelines, this is another thing. If you look at a map of pipelines in the United States, they're all over. It's like spaghetti. So what does like fighting against one pipeline do? Well, to be honest, I don't think, this is just me, but not a lot. But the overall, why are they fighting? Because we need to get off fossil fuels. That's the main point. And it manifests in the specific place on a specific land with specific indigenous communities. But the broad goal is to, and the broad voice of the indigenous communities are to get off fossil fuels. So that's what I think about that one.
Thank you.
And it's a symbolic act of challenging tribal sovereignty, right? I mean, it's that. So to your last point, that's the piece of it, right?
Yeah, and if you hear it, like it's get off fossil fuels. It's water is sacred. We need to be doing work to maintain that sacred bond we all have with water. We're made of water, right? The womb of the mother is water, right? There's water that we're made of. Where we have, all of us have a deep connection to water. If we didn't have water, we'd not be here. And so recognizing that, and again, it's in a specific place at a specific time. And maybe it's the breaking point, like some of the wildfires, right? It's like, holy smokes, like this is it. And I think many indigenous people in that Dakota Access Pipeline are saying we have to stop it here and now. You hear that. Yeah.
So similarly to Chris, I think this talk has been really fascinating for me because it's kind of tied in a lot of my interests into one kind of presentation. And I think every time that I plan to bring something up or segue to something, you guys kind of already address it. And so just to give you a little bit of background, I grew up a few hours from the Dakota Access Pipeline in Williston, North Dakota. And another funny segue too is my college decision came down to Minnesota and Boise State. So I wonder, had I gone there, would I have met you anyways? But
go Broncos. No, just kidding.
Yeah, go Broncos. But anyways, my kind of educational path has been, I came here having seen everything going on with the Dakota Access Pipeline, and oil runs my town. And so I was curious with environmental issues and thought that was the best way for me to get more informed on the greater picture. And that led me to water. And I thought water was what I wanted to study. And I have a minor in hydrology, but I took an internship with USGS and realized that wasn't what I was passionate about either. And over the since high school, basically, I've been really interested in indigenous issues. Having grown up and run with a lot of Native Americans, I was completely unaware of the struggles they faced on the reservations and struggles that I could never fathom on my own. And I think as Emily, I think, knows, I've decided to kind of shift my grad focus towards film. And one way I hope to, I guess, contribute to those issues is to tell stories. And I think there's many stories back home that need to be told for the Native populations there. But too, even your talk today, I felt like there was a number of stories that I kind of gleaned from what you were saying. And there's just, in every way, it just seems like all indications keep pointing me towards the intersection of all these issues and how Native people fit into that equation and what they can offer up. And it's really time that people start listening. And however people can get informed of that is going to be really important, whether that's in the educational system or films. I think there's been a lot of good films in recent years that have kind of started to show those struggles and why they need to be included in those conversations. But your talk today was incredibly inspiring, I guess, and seeing all those intersections again come up, it's just like seems really clear that that's a good way to take things.
Thank you so much. That's great to hear. Just a little like minor thing, the public television in Minnesota, if you go on their website, they're streaming a bunch of Native films this month for free. So if you're interested in seeing some of them, I haven't watched, I've watched a number of them, so I don't remember though what they're showing, if they have any specifically on the environment. But there's some cool documentaries. One is called Rumble that I really like, which is Native, basically like natives that rock. And so all these Native Americans that have been rock and roll musicians that you probably might not know are Native. It's pretty cool. It's that if you like music, that's a good one. There's some hip hop.
Where was this on, you said?
Minnesota Public Television. It's
okay.
It's I think it's like Native American Month. And so they're streaming all these Native films. There's a vibrant Native film community. So, you know, awesome. I encourage you to hook up with some of them. Are you a grad student there at Boise State? It sounded like.
I'm in my senior year here at Boise State, and I'm currently looking at there's a film program at Montana State.
Oh yeah, great.
That I hope to take.
I'd also, because you're an undergrad still, our Wild Rice project, we have, like I said, Native and non-Native students. It's a research experience for undergraduates. So we've done that every year, and it's been really fun. And actually, we have students from Salish Kootenai College and then Humboldt State. We kind of all combine forces for this undergraduate research program. Check out the website that I'm a part of. I don't know if I gave it to everyone, but I can put it in the chat here.
I'd love that. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, we don't have it listed yet for the summer, but you can keep your eye out.
That sounds good.
Yeah, and I'll put that on the syllabus and share it with the whole environmental studies listserv too. That's a great opportunity. Yeah.
There you
go. I had a question, but before that, I just wanted for 11 years, I worked at a print shop in South Dakota, and the Intertribal Buffalo Council was a block away from our office.
Oh, cool.
And we printed their magazine every 2 to 3 months. And the work they were doing is great. They have a big, strong effort to try to get bison meat back into the school lunches on tribal communities. And it was really interesting to read all about that as I'm operating the machines at work. But my question is, if you know or if you can speak of how federal agencies are cooperating or not with tribal governments on cultural or archaeological issues.
That's where we've seen most of the work in the past is around cultural heritage stuff. And in fact, in the paper, we go into that a little bit. It's been a little bit of a problem sometimes, I think, because it's a myopic view of what tribes are interested in. But then the archaeologists that work for the agencies, they have interests and understand tribes a little bit for the most part. And so they're the logical people that help make those partnerships work. We argue to expand them into natural resource stuff. But in general, the agencies and the tribes have different relationships. So again, that diversity idea. Some tribes have great relationships, some tribes don't. The relationships change over time. So then where once was a terrible relationship between an agency and a tribe might now be very good, vice versa. So it really is kind of dependent upon the actual issue, the agency itself, the people involved. So it really varies. That's my answer is it really varies.
So it's complicated, like life tends to be.
Yeah, and that it argues for digging into the specific place with the specific tribes and specific agencies at any given moment in time.
Perfect. Well, thank you.
Thank you.
The print shop I worked for, we did a lot of printing. We did course catalog for the Ogallala Lakota College and all that sort of thing. So I read up on a lot of that while I was at work. It was interesting stuff.
Oh yeah.
Do you know why then the Idaho and no tribes from Idaho are participating in the Buffalo Treaty? That's something I've been curious about because a colleague showed me the map a couple weeks ago and I was looking at it and I was thinking about it in the context of this class. And it was just really interesting to me that it seemed to be such a transnational and multi-nation treaty and Idaho was not at the table.
I don't remember reading anything specifically on that, but I do know that it tended to be tribes that had a program for raising and selling bison on tribal land.
That makes sense.
And so they use the money, a lot of that from the sale of bison to fund, being able to feed school children bison meat at lunch without having to raise the cost of providing meals. I think that was the major focus of it. So they were big advocates for a traditional native diet on the reservations.
That's a point too with climate change that I've had, like I said, decades worth of experience on climate change meetings with tribes. And we would see, when did I first start doing those climate change meetings? Like 2005, maybe, started having some of these climate change meetings with tribes. And they would bring up food at these meetings. Food sovereignty would come up that as a term. Food, is an important thing in climate change. The broader society was not talking about food and climate change. Now I think we are. I think this is an area too where this tribal ideas have gotten into the mainstream, which is a good thing. So we're starting to think about food sovereignty and traditional foods or native foods or foods that are produced in our bioregion. That was always a part of those meetings. And only recently in the last, I mean, even last 5 years, I'd say we're starting to see a little bit more with food and climate change. But the tribes really they know that. They've been talking about it.
Yeah, I mean, it's also the traditional Western or American diet. I mean, it's not good even for European descendant people who kind of evolved with it, let alone peoples whose ancestry was with more healthy food. It's just not a good for the body.
Yeah. And then you can combine that with like the fossil fuels and things. Like there's a lot of reasons to try to get to more native foods for all of us. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you very much.
Just watched an incredible. Oh, sorry, Daniel. Incredible film about they're reintroducing this farmer who was he was a cattle rancher. He's reintroducing buffalo on the South Dakota prairies, and not only has the cost of production and to feed the animals been lower because they can subsist off the land naturally, but they've noticed that the buffalo roaming the prairies again has allowed to greater carbon sequestration in the soil, which is just a crazy effect as well. And so not only is the soil healthier, the buffalo are healthier, and everything's just working better. I thought that was really fascinating to see what happened when they reintroduced them to their natural habitat.
Yeah.
Will you send me a link to that, Leif? I'd love to watch that.
Yeah, I will.
That film that you're talking about. And Mike, thank you so much for staying on and for answering all these. It's so great to see the students so engaged with it. And when we started putting the class together, you know, one of the through lines that I really hoped would be in it was collaboration and partnership. And, you know, it's not the first thing people think of when they think of public lands, but we really tried to build it in. And I think you put a very fine point on it today in a way that it hasn't quite appeared in other talks. I mean, we've heard about different angles. That the talk last week was about Idaho Conservation, Idaho's biggest environmental group, the Idaho Conservation League, seated in getting the Boulder White Clouds declared wilderness. Okay. And so the way it was told was basically environmentalists and Republican congressmen going fishing, right? And going out, like you said, walking the land and being there together and sort of crossing that bridge. But there was such a broader angle to the way that you partnership and the really important steps, you know, the sort of breaking it down in a way that's like possible.
And you made the point that I usually make, but I didn't today, that these are techniques or insights for any partnership.
Yeah.
Like going out on the land together, eating food together, right? All this stuff is how do you build relationships and partnerships? Yeah, this is specific to tribes, but it's good for any partnership.
Yeah, and it makes all of those things better, right? I mean, it's come up a lot in the class because John Freemuth, whose class this was, right? I mean, he was particularly skilled at it. So we've talked about it in relation to how he did it on a personal level. But I think you've given us a really sort of systematic way of thinking about how wonderful it can foster these changes. So really appreciate that.
Great. Well, thank you for inviting me. I really had a good time.